So thanks everyone for joining. In the interest of time, we'll get started. I'm sure more people will join as we continue. I'm Amber Reed, president of AAPI New Jersey. Thanks so much for joining us today for a special Lunch and Learn on the New Jersey Voter Empowerment Act. We're really happy to have Ronak Patel and Patrick Stegemoeller from ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, here today as our special guests. These are the people that we learned about the what was on the New Jersey Voting Rights Act from, and they've just been a huge support to our organization. Very excited to host them. I will share a little bit about them. Ronak Patel is an Equal Justice Works Fellow at ALDEF. He joined ALDEF in 2022. A graduate of the UCLA School of Law, Ronak worked on language access, prison gerrymandering, and redistricting issues during internships with Latino Justice PRL-DEF and the ACLU Voting Rights Project in New York City, and later as a legal fellow with the UCLA Voting Rights Project. Patrick Stegemoeller, who's a staff attorney in the Democracy Program at ALDEF, joined the organization in 2021 after serving as a staff attorney at the Guardian Project of the Vera Institute of Justice in New York City. He has also worked with the League of Conservation Voters in Washington, D.C., where he represented the legal department in racial and environmental justice programs related to the 2020 census, voter registration, and climate justice. A graduate of Georgetown University Law Center, Patrick received a special certification in refugee and humanitarian emergencies following his clinical work on behalf of migrant individuals with kids in need of defense in Washington, D.C., and the Center for Transnational Legal Studies in London. So Ronak and Patrick, thank you again, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Amber, and thank you all for joining today. I am going to share my screen and kick us off, talking about what is now called the John R. Lewis New Jersey Voter Empowerment Act. It was called the New Jersey Voting Rights Act until about a week ago. So we're running on this new name. The act itself, though, has relatively not changed. It's currently in the Senate and Assembly as Assembly Bill 4083 and Senate Bill 3009. It was introduced last week on the 18th, and we're hoping to have a big push for it along with the grander coalition of New Jersey civil rights and voting rights organizations, hopefully this summer, starting in May. So just to get us started off, how would the NJVEA help New Jerseyans? So the big piece here is it'll enable New Jersey to have a strong and comprehensive set of voter protections that go beyond federal guarantees. And so up until now, and since the 1960s, we've had the Federal Voting Rights Act, which provided a lot of great protections for minority voters, and then later, language minority voters, oftentimes who are Asian American. The problem with that is federal law has been under consistent attack by those who don't view it as necessary for minorities to have equal protection when it comes to voting. And so now many states, including New York and Connecticut, have enacted their own voting rights acts. And in this case, in New Jersey, we're aiming to pass a New Jersey Voter Empowerment Act. There's a lot of disparities in voting and democracy access for minority communities, and especially for Asian Americans. When there are key elections, longer lines tend to be at poll sites in minority communities. There's oftentimes not a ton of transparency when it comes to local government, whether that's redistricting or elections process. And there also isn't really a lot of transparency on who gets to make these decisions, whether it's how long poll sites, where poll sites are, how communication is done to the community as to where poll sites will be in future elections, all those kinds of things that come to really at the crux of how do we vote, where do we vote, when do we vote? And these have real life impacts. When minority communities are cut out of legislative decision-making and executive decision-making, a lot of the issues that impact our communities most directly tend to be swept under the rug or not really approached in a robust way. This has led to inequalities, both in terms of arrest rates and employment and healthcare and housing. One pretty stark example is how property taxes are often assessed in a lot of states, where newer immigrants or folks who are buying their first home tend to be paying higher rates than older residents who tend to be whiter. And this has really been shown in terms of both um, differential rates in all of these categories. And the core of it is really there's a differential rates in voter turnout and registration between white citizens of New Jersey and nationwide and the state's Black, Latino, and Asian population. So, what is a state's Voting Rights Act? And as I was kind of alluding to earlier, a state voting rights act essentially is an extension and expansion of voting rights guaranteed under the federal Voting Rights Act of 1965. So, this was the big act that came towards the end of Jim Crow that was designed to open up the political process to first Black voters and then to all minority voters. And this is called really the crown jewel of civil rights legislation that really enabled us to move towards a more multiracial open democracy. State voting rights acts seek to kind of make a lot of the processes that were under the federal Voting Rights Act more efficient, but also expand the protections that were guaranteed by federal law. And these different expansions, my colleague Patrick will go over as we continue with the presentation. But the key pieces are not just restoring pieces of the federal Voting Rights Act that have been curtailed by the Supreme Court over the last couple decades, but to expand and improve voter protection, to enable minority communities and minority voters to both access the ballot effectively, but also to exercise power as a group and actively participate in our democracy as equal citizens. There have been several states' voting rights acts. The first one was in California. But over the last 5 to 6 years, we've seen an explosion of these acts in a variety of states in the Pacific states as well as the East Coast. And then there's a new national coalition pushing these voting rights acts across the country in places like Maryland, Minnesota, Maine, Massachusetts, and New Jersey. The goal here is really to ensure that we have an open democracy. And after each of these states, the acts get stronger, the acts get bigger as we learn more and more of what is the best way to kind of move forward and where the expansions of the act can really impact minority communities and enable us to equally access the ballot. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Patrick to talk more of the nitty-gritty details of what is in the NJVEA.
Thanks, Ronak. Yeah, we'll get into the details here about what this proposed litigation can do for communities in New Jersey. And I think kind of the two big things you want to think about are, as Ronak mentioned, it's about increasing access and reducing barriers. Basically, everything that we're talking about here can fit into one of those two camps, where it's either removing something that makes it difficult for voters to have their vote effectuated at the poll, or making it easier for organizations, for individual voters, for even in some senses, the administration or the legislature itself in New Jersey to promote voting rights activity and to make sure that these laws are being enforced and are being enforced in a way that allows the targeted communities of color here, often, or language minority communities, to have their voices heard at the polls. And that happens in a variety of ways that we're about to get into here, in terms of language access, in terms of redistricting, even in terms of how we're going to direct the courts to interpret these laws. It's a substantial and holistic package that is going to promote access and reduce barriers. And we can move into that now. Do I have control, or does Ronak have control? Ronak has control. So right, we'll get into the bill. So this is the first one that I talked about a little bit there, about how we instruct the court to interpret the laws. This is something that all the lawyers will get excited about. It's a democracy canon, which essentially makes the courts have to consider the voter access as the primary concern when they're looking at a case involving voting rights. And this is a response to a lot of what has been happening at the federal level with the Federal Voting Rights Act that Ronak mentioned, passed in 1965, but has been chipped away by the Supreme Court over the past several decades. Some cases you might have heard of, Shelby County versus Holder, which removed preclearance. There's cases that have made it difficult to even bring voting rights claims under the Voting Rights Act anymore. And we're seeing a case right now coming out of the Eighth Circuit in Arkansas that is saying that there's no private right of action to even enforce Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So as federal courts have chipped away at the Federal Voting Rights Act in New Jersey, we want to make sure that all these good things that we get passed, all these voter access provisions that we put in are going to stand up to the scrutiny of the court, and that judges have to have the first priority be, how do we ensure access to voters here? Now we can talk about what some of these great provisions are that we'll be upholding. And paramount here is protecting vote dilution. And that is often done through the redistricting process, where communities of color are either packed into one, whether it's congressional or state legislature, or even on smaller levels like city council. We've got racial or language minority communities that are put into one district so that their influence doesn't expand across the rest of the voting area, or they're cracked into many different districts all across the state, and they're not able to exert their influence. So the New Jersey Voting Rights Act in New Jersey would prevent the redistricting process from having this dilutive effect, prevent packing, prevent cracking, and elevate what we call influence districts, which are when you have a minority, racial or language minority population that has the ability to influence an election, has the ability to have a say in the political process, a reasonable opportunity to elect a candidate of choice. When there is sufficient density, when there's sufficient cohesion existing, then the redistricting process has to protect those communities and elevate them and ensure that they are going to have the ability to have a say in the election. And that's going to be one of the most important things that we get in here, because what we're trying to do is make sure that we have access to representation for these communities. We can move to the next slide. And I've said language minorities here a couple times, because that is one of the key focuses of the act as well, is ensuring language access for voters. There is Section 203 of the VRA, as you can see here, which is a federal law that covers some parts of the country where you have a high enough level of limited English proficient voters and a high enough percentage of the population of those voters there. But the coverage formula is somewhat restrictive. It only covers 2 areas in New Jersey currently. So we are expanding that formula through the New Jersey Voter Empowerment Act, so that much more of the state would be covered for language access provisions. And that means translators, interpreters at the polls. That means translated physical materials. That means translated registration materials. And essentially ensuring that language will never be a reason why someone is unable to vote in New Jersey. We can move to the next slide. And then similarly, we want to make sure that any laws that are put in place that relate to elections, whether it is the design of a ballot, whether it is where polling locations are put, any law cannot result in the denial or abridgment of the rights of members of a racial or language minority. And this ties into what we'll get to, I believe, in the next slide, which is our pre-clearance program. Great. All right, I knew where the slides were. So pre-clearance is a word some of you maybe have heard before, maybe some of you haven't. It was a really important part of the Federal Voting Rights Act that the Supreme Court stripped out in 2013. And essentially what it does, as you can see here in the slides, anytime a area wants to pass a law that impacts elections, they have to be pre-cleared by, in the federal context, to be the Department of Justice. uh, to make sure that it would not have a discriminatory impact. And this was a really important provision because it stopped a lot of harmful policies from coming into place in the first place. So going back to the example of polling place location, if a municipality was going to pass a law that would make sure that polling place locations were, not accessible by public transportation or were put into lower density areas for populations, you could show that that would have a discriminatory effect and the law would not go into place. And this is great for a couple of reasons. One, it stops many policies from going into place in the first place. And two, it happens before long and expensive litigation, which is currently our only recourse when something like this happens, is we have to get all these lawyers involved and we have to go to court and then it gets delayed and it gets appealed. And these are all important cases, but it takes a long time. And I think we've all been frustrated with the speed at which things are proceeding through the courts. And we want a pre-clearance program in place in New Jersey so that when bad actors are trying to prevent people from voting effectively, when they're trying to install discriminatory impacts at the ballot, we're able to stamp it out right away before it has a harmful impact. And that's one of the most important things we're trying to do with the bill here. And then this one's for the data wonks out there. In order to bring cases that we want to bring to protect voters in New Jersey, in order to, go to our policymakers, our legislative representatives, and show them, hey, we need a fix here. We need, to tweak this law and change this law so we can help more people vote. You need data, you need evidence for it. And something that this bill will do is it will create a database that makes publicly available all of the important demographic data, all the important election-related data that goes into being able to show, hey, you've moved a polling center to a place that is totally inaccessible to the community who needs to vote there, that can show, hey, there is a large population of limited English proficient Korean-speaking voters in this area, and there needs to be language access there. With this data openly available and being collected and having a robust database for it, we're able to prove those cases much more easily. And we're able to not only in New Jersey demonstrate the cases that we need to, but also as part of a nationwide plan for elevating voting rights everywhere in the country, help contribute to academic articles, help contribute to cases elsewhere, and essentially show the reality of what is happening and needs to be addressed. And then one of the additional very, very important prongs here is something that prohibits voter intimidation, deception, violence, essentially making sure that laws that are in place at polling sites relating to voting have as their first priority preventing voter intimidation, have as their first priority making sure that people are able to vote in a way that is effective, that doesn't, is not prevented in any way by the types of things that we have seen around the country and in some cases in New Jersey that intimidates voters, particularly voters of color, voters who have of language minority, who have been the targets of such voter intimidation efforts in the past. And we do this by making sure that judges and the court system have the correct have the ability to tailor remedies that actually resolve these harms. And also we do it by making sure that things like disinformation and other things that are aimed at dissuading voters of color or naturalized citizens from voting are able to be addressed adequately. And that's it for now. That's a lot of sort of information that we've put at you here. I hope there was at least something in there that got you excited, some issue that you heard of. You think like, yeah, that is something that we really need to have happen in New Jersey, because we view this as a really, really important piece of legislation, because we have a chance right now to address so many of these concerns in one holistic package where, as we talked about, the parts of it like help out other parts, where we have the data bill so that we can do language access, or we have the democracy canon so that it's easier for us to bring cases about voter intimidation. We have pre-clearance put in place so that we don't even have to bring some cases at all, because we have the ability to just enforce these laws right away without needing to go through expensive litigation. I think it's a really important bill. It's one that we've worked really hard on with many, many community partners across the state, and we're still continuing to work hard on it. And we would love to answer any questions that you have about any part of it here today while we have time.
Thank you so much, Ronak and Patrick. Does anyone have any questions? Or do you have maybe an experience voting that you'd like to share? Very curious about whether you've ever encountered any obstacles or difficulty understanding the ballot, that sort of issue. I can start with a question, which is going to start with a reflection, which is that a lot of people don't necessarily think of New Jersey as sort of being a state where obstacles to voting and voter suppression might be an issue, the same way we think of it as being an issue in, say, Texas. So how would you help, are there any examples you could offer that would sort of underscore the actual importance and urgency of this act?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think a lot of the northeastern states and mid-Atlantic states get away with the illusion that they're extremely progressive and extremely open to minorities versus some of the southern states that you see in the news quite often. But oftentimes that obscures realities on the ground, especially at the local level. I think obviously a lot of us have been talking about the line and how county parties have such a hard and strong influence, and these county parties tend to be run disproportionately by people who are white and people who are men. The other piece is also, as Asian Americans start moving out into places that in the state that aren't as racially diverse as some of the places that we've called home, like Middlesex or Essex or Bergen counties. Those are places where we're really seeing an effect of both perhaps not legal racism but de facto racism in terms of getting access to resources and infrastructure payments, or sorry, funding, where you'll see that parts of town that are heavily immigrant or heavily minority are less developed or are less likely to get permits or are more likely to pay higher share of property taxes because of assessment systems. So this is really common specifically in like middle class suburbs, where we're seeing a lot of these effects, not only in New Jersey, but in New York and in Massachusetts as well, where folks who just moved into these communities are not really getting the same access to resources as their disproportionately white neighbors who have been living there for decades. So I think that's the really big area. And we see this also through just elections, where in a lot of these places where they are now being required to give language access, they've become reticent to really spend the time and the money to hire the proper bilingual poll workers and interpreters and take the time to translate the materials. And a lot of times this resistance isn't based in like fact, where they'll say, oh, it's going to be too expensive, but they actually haven't looked into how much it would actually cost. And so that's another piece where, because federal law has gotten more difficult to enforce, it's really great to have a state law that has a state democracy canon that encourages courts to fine for voters when their rights have been infringed on. So I think those are the two big areas where it's folks moving into just areas that have been traditionally very white, and also the effect on people's real lives where access to resources is being curtailed or really being funneled more towards older white residents.
Yeah, and I think, we see instances of, in Aldef's work, one of the areas that we are heavily involved in is language access. And, we do poll monitoring and, exit polling all around the country. And in New Jersey, we get cases every single year of, someone who, has an issue with language access because there wasn't, the sort of a sufficient interpreter staffed there at the site, or an issue where someone's being asked to show their ID inappropriately, even though they don't have to. And it's not always a malicious thing done by people who are intentionally trying to suppress voters, but the suppression happens nonetheless. And and sometimes it is intentional and malicious. But it's about sort of dealing with the impact and not the intent that I think is really important. And then when we hear from people saying like, oh, we don't have these issues in whether it's Connecticut or New York or New Jersey, I think sometimes it's because they don't think of, oh, there's this like strong, history of racist intent here, discriminatory intent here, which usually there is. But even in the cases where there's not, we still see the impact happening. And it's that impact that is really important to address here. And that's something that we think this bill does.
And under this statute, who would be in charge of the monitoring and enforcement? Just thinking about these 21 county boards of election that would have to understand the act and implement it.
Yeah, that's a good question as well. So that question is kind of bounced around because of some idiosyncrasies with New Jersey's Attorney General's office. But right now, as the bill currently stands, it would be an office within the Attorney General's office. There was a little bit of going back and forth because what's odd about New Jersey is the Attorney General is also defends county boards of elections in certain types of cases. And so I believe they've decoupled that in this version of the act. But yes, the Attorney General will be the party that is responsible for administering the pre-clearance process that Patrick was talking about. They'll decide which jurisdictions, whether that's towns or cities or counties, are covered. Because they have some sort of voting rights violation or civil rights violation or racial disparity. And they'll be responsible for doing that each year. And then additionally, what's nice about this act is it explicitly allows voters and civic organizations to bring suits, which is unfortunately now an open question under federal law, which is the Arkansas case that Patrick was talking about, where they've called into question whether voters and civic organizations can bring these suits. But under the NJVEA, normal folks and voters would be able to also bring suits in addition to the AG.
And in the chat, Aina has a question. What would be helpful at this stage? Letters, phone calls?
So there will be hearings. They haven't been scheduled yet in either May or June. New Jersey and the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice is leading up our coalition. And so they've been the direct contacts with the legislature. But during that time, when there are hearings, it would great to have folks both either testify or submit written testimony or reach out to their legislatures to push them to vote yes on the NJVEA. But once we get closer to those dates, we can send out more information that's more precise as to what the call to action is.
Hey, Ronak and Patrick, I have a question. How, New Jersey doesn't have that many places where you have ballots other than in English. I think it's just a couple of places in New Jersey. How would this law sort of boost the number of ballots, say, in Korean or Chinese or Hindi?
Sorry, Jeff, the beginning of your question got cut off. Do you mind repeating it?
Oh yeah, sorry. How will this law increase the number of ballots in different languages?
Mm-hmm. So as Patrick was talking about, the coverage formula for language access materials and interpreters is a much lower threshold under this version of the bill versus federal law. So if 2% of the population or at least 4,000 voters or eligible voters belong to some language minority group, that language is covered. Based on the 2021 data we ran, the two places where we'll see an expansion of ballots immediately is in Bergen County and in Middlesex County, specifically with Chinese, which will probably be Mandarin in both of those counties. That being said, that data is obviously a couple of years out of date. So we're hoping as we see more, there will probably be more coverage as well for other Asian languages. Spanish is actually the biggest expansion where you'll see a lot of more Spanish language ballots. But for Asian languages, at least, we'll see Chinese added, and Bergen is already covered for Korean, and Middlesex is covered for Asian Indian, which is the county has decided to do Gujarati to meet that liability, or sorry, that responsibility under federal law.
And will the law provide any funding for the counties to create to create these ballots, or is there any appropriation associated with the law?
Not right now. The bill itself does not provide any funding for language access, but I think there's ongoing I think that's one of the big hiccups and points in which the legislature is a little hesitant, and we need to work out in order to assuage those feelings that this is an unfunded mandate. That being said, a lot of the conversation that we've seen in our 203 work on other states has been this fear that it will cost a lot of money, but that fear is not based in actual looking at what the cost will really be. And we've shown in a couple places where it's really a big upfront cost to get a lot of the materials translated. And then after that, it kind of becomes relatively low cost, because a lot of these things are things that you're going to have to be paying for anywhere. One of the big ways that, for example, Middlesex deals with its compliance for interpreters it hires a lot of bilingual poll workers. So there's no actual cost differential. You still have to hire poll workers. You just happen to hire ones that are also fluent in Gujarati. And so there are a lot of the longer term reoccurring costs are actually not that high. It's just the initial getting everything translated and making the tweaks every year to keep it up to date.
Yeah, for the non-voting rights attorneys here, can you talk about what 203 is and this bill's threshold in relation to that?
Yeah, it's a provision that was added to the Federal Voting Rights Act by amendment. And essentially what it does is it ensures that in covered areas and covered, and we use the phrase covered to essentially mean you meet the thresholds that are put out. And that is, again, having a certain percentage of the voting age population. Is it voting age population, right? Or is it overall population?
No, it's voting age.
It's voting age population.
It's all potential eligible voters.
Right, potential eligible voters. Because that's something people forget about sometimes when you're looking at population data, is whether you're looking at voting age or just total pop. It's a certain percentage of the voting age population is limited English proficient, and there is sufficient numerosity of those voters. Either they reach a certain numerical threshold of 10,000 voters, or they are a certain percentage of an area. And once you are covered, then Section 203 mandates that this jurisdiction provides essentially anything that you're doing in English, you have to do in this covered language. So, for example, I believe Bergen is covered for Korean, I'm pretty sure, Korean language. And so that means that in Bergen County, any document that the Board of Elections produces in terms of instructions on how to vote, instructions on how to register, the ballot itself has to be translated into the covered language, which in this case would be Korean. It means that you have to have live language interpretation, because if you have English-speaking poll workers there who can assist a voter or tell them, here's how the voting machine works, here's how to mark your ballot, here's where you go, then you need someone who speaks Korean who can also provide that. And we work with jurisdictions around the country to ensure that their 203 compliance programs are effective and are allowing voters to actually get access to what they need to vote. And I think one of the most important things about 203 that I would love everyone to take away from this is not just that it provides language access and that your experience at the poll can be better, or that you're able to, more effectively cast your vote. It's a mechanism that allows for higher voter turnout among populations that have historically had lower turnout. And we've seen when 203 coverage kicks in somewhere in the country, voter turnout spikes for that language minority, whether it's Korean in Bergen County, whether it's Vietnamese in Houston, because having these language services removes voter suppression. And when we remove voter suppression, people are able to come to the polls and are able to have their voice heard and shape their communities more effectively. So that's why we think 203 is important. And that's why we want to make sure that the state bill will include these protections for wider parts of the population that just the federal 203 doesn't cover. And additionally, the federal Section 203 coverage is set to expire in 2031 and needs to be reauthorized by Congress. Now, I don't know what your feelings are about how effective Congress is at getting things done these days, but we don't want to have to leave it to chance. We don't want to have to leave it to the federal government to reauthorize and repass 203. We want to have a New Jersey act that already provides all this coverage. So if Washington, D.C. can't get its act together, voters in New Jersey are still protected.
Thank you. I see some great questions coming in the chat. I'm going to start reading those out loud so they're known to the people viewing the recording later as well. But before we close this out, I just want to ask a leading question, which is, do you see that new 2% threshold for, percentage of voters speaking a certain language who would be required to add the new language being a sticking point trying to get this bill through the legislature? And do you see Asian American voices as particularly important in keeping that new lower threshold?
Yeah, I think the threshold is really going to be a sticking point for the legislature, and the communities that are most impacted by by raising the threshold are going to disproportionately be Asian American, right? Because in most places in the county where there's a strong, where there are a significant number of Spanish LEP voters, they're usually clearing the higher thresholds that have been proposed or discussed. And so Asian Americans also, because we're a little bit more geographically dispersed in the state, are likely to have issues hitting a higher threshold. Just like under federal law, there's only 2 places in the state that are covered, even though there are several counties with really large Asian American populations. So as we go through this process of getting it through the legislature, that's something that we're going to try to fight for, to keep these thresholds relatively low. I know there's also a lot of concern that what will happen is that single jurisdictions will be responsible for several languages as opposed to what we would want. Sorry, I shouldn't say it like that. Where we would want more places to provide more, what it seems like in the near term, it will be the same number of places will have to provide more. And so in Bergen and in Middlesex, they'd now be responsible for 4 languages. So English, Spanish, Chinese, and then Korean or Gujarati, depending on which county you're talking about. So that's another sticking point where a lot of the legislatures are getting cold feet, especially from those counties on, well, we're already doing 3 languages, a 4th is going to be a big lift. So that's definitely something that we're concerned about and is going to impact specifically Asian American communities the most.
Thank you. So Susan in the chat asks, or says, I am all for publicly accessible election information and databases to increase transparency and allow for identification of potential voting rights violations. What demographic data is contemplated to be part of a database? Any potential privacy issues?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the underlying data that the demographic data will be created from is the census and ACS data that the Census Bureau already does. I forget the exact phrase they use, but essentially they create noise at the very local level, at the block level, so that in order to maintain the privacy of individuals living in that block. So it's not new. None of this information would be new or not already public available somewhere. The whole point of the Institute when it comes to the demographic data is to force the jurisdictions to publish that in a really accessible manner. And an essential place for the state, for all jurisdictions, for all towns and counties. So luckily, there's no new information that would raise new privacy concerns. The big piece where the demographic data comes in is when municipalities do redistricting, and they have to show, okay, this district that we drew is X% Asian American, X% Black, X% white, and then the same in terms of citizen voting age population. And a lot of that citizen voting age population is really important for a lot of litigation when it comes to redistricting. And it's actually not directly available most of the time. And so you usually have to hire an expert who can stitch together that data and show that a given district has this degree of Asian Americans who are citizens who are over 18. And so a lot of that data, like analysis, to draw that together is really costly and time intensive. And the jurisdictions are supposed to be doing this anyway. And so now this just forces them to share it centrally so that everybody has access to that information, and you don't have to go through the process of hiring an expert, doing all the data analysis, and then coming up with the figures. It also will enable folks to challenge jurisdictions when they clearly have done something wrong in their data that has led them or allowed them to do something discriminatory when they're drawing the maps, which is something that comes up sometimes as well. And it's kind of an ongoing issue where some states and jurisdictions have argued that they want to use citizen voting age population to draw the lines, which is really different than we've ever done in America and would really hurt Asian and Latino communities who have really large immigrant populations who are not citizens yet, and who are disproportionately folks who are underage, who should be counted and deserve representation, but aren't old enough to vote yet. And so that's something we want to make sure that we kind of get ahead of before it becomes an issue. Did that answer the question, Susan?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks. And in the chat, Parul asks, is there also going to be focus brought to municipal committees and primary election vote and voter rights violations, and how minorities are kept off them, where the decisions are made for who leads you locally?
So then it looks like I'll address almost the second little question he has here, because I think it informs the first about primary ballots. So yes, any ballot for any election that the state carries out, which is essentially all of them, must be translated into the covered language. And I think you make a great point here that we have spent too much time thinking just big picture about federal elections, about presidential elections, and those are obviously very important. But I think we are really trying to refocus more on local elections, on state elections, and that's something that I'm really excited about with this bill, because it provides protections all the way down. And it really emphasizes and looks at things that, have been involved in litigation before in cases of school board districts, of how those get drawn, and how elections work there, because we recognize that so much of what actually, matters is, as you say here, who leads you locally. So much power is concentrated in the decisions made at local elections. So making sure that these protections apply to those smaller elections actually has a tremendous impact on the community.
And something I'd like to add to that as well is this act is really hyper-focused on local and county work. Because of New Jersey's constitution, the statewide maps and the congressional maps can't be touched outside of that process. So this is really focused on what counties are doing in terms of managing elections, and what cities and towns are doing in terms of how elections are run, who gets elected, what's the process. And one key thing to point out is when California passed its Voting Rights Act back in 2002, it focused on at-large elections, which I think, if record serves me right, a lot of New Jersey's town school boards are at-large and not districted. Over 200 municipalities have shifted from at-large to district-based elections, because for the most part, at-large elections benefit the white majority and prevent Asian Americans, Latinos, and Black voters from really electing candidates of choice. And so it's even as in some places you've had situations where minorities have now become the majority and can elect, but in a lot of places in New Jersey, they're 30% or 40% or less. And in those situations, district-based elections can really enable folks to have someone and have a voice on school boards or city councils where, let's be honest, most of the stuff that affects our families' lives and our lives most directly is decided at the municipal level.
Thank you. Parul, did that answer your question? Okay, I saw her, but now I think she's turned off her camera again.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. I couldn't find a good one. I'm sorry.
It's okay. All right, thanks, Parul. Great question. And Lavi asks, what counties are in need of multilingual poll workers? How can we sign up? Can poll workers be from out of district? Seeing a more diverse representation at polling places could be beneficial.
So yeah, I can add to this. Like Patrick was saying, in Bergen County, they are obligated to provide interpretation in Korean, and in Middlesex, it's Gujarati. So technically it's Asian Indian, but they opted into a specific language, which is Gujarati. Though there's value in having folks who speak Hindi or Urdu or Punjabi as well. And that being said, I think there's a lot of other places across the state that might not be obligated to have bilingual poll workers and interpreters, but would benefit from it. So, for example, we do a lot of election monitoring and exit polling in Hudson County and in Jersey City, where there's huge Tagalog and Hindi speaking populations, as well as Punjabi. So there's need pretty much anywhere where there's large Asian American communities, there's language needs. So I don't believe that there's any restriction on if you have to be in that specific, like, registered to vote in that jurisdiction. And Patrick, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't believe New Jersey has put any of those barriers in place. But I think if you look at the chat, there's a link for poll worker, more information. But yes, definitely volunteer. I think for me, I grew up in Livingston, and I think the poll workers at my poll site were the same grandma and grandpa every single year. So it would be nice to have more folks come in, and especially because I think there's just a national poll worker shortage. So the more people who can volunteer to do that work, which is vital to our elections, is the more the better.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good question because while I agree with Ronak, I'm not aware of New Jersey passing any restrictions on being able to volunteer to be an interpreter or work as a poll worker in different counties. There are states that have done stuff like that. I think we talked a little bit before about how everyone just thinks Texas is the bad state. There's other stuff going on, but Texas definitely has done this, and we've litigated something similar down there. So it's a really good question to sort of and shows the kind of areas in which subtle suppression can occur, right? Where it's a rule that would basically have no reason for existing other than to make it harder for people to vote. And there are little rules like that are sort of embedded in almost invisible ways through a lot of our election systems. And while that one I don't believe does exist in New Jersey, other rules like that are things that we are trying to prevent with this. All these things that, and when you add them all up, lead to substantial voter suppression that impacts who ends up getting elected to lead our communities.
That's such a good point. Thank you for your question, Lavi. Anyone else have a question? Feel free to come off mute. All right, well, we'll give you all 8 minutes back. Thank you so much for joining us. Tremendous thanks to Ronak and Patrick. This was just so good and substantive and informative. We really appreciate you spending the time with us today. We'll have another Lunch and Learn on April 19th on domestic workers' rights. So we'll definitely send info out on that. You can all join us again.
Thank you all for having us.
All right, thanks all. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.